All right, everybody, welcome to chapter 17. This is the last chapter for Anatomy and Physiology 1, and this is covering the endocrine system. So today we're going to really focus on the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the roles that they play in hormones, because that's what the endocrine system is dealing with hormones that are put into the bloodstream. So to kind of overview of the endocrine system, we've talked a lot about cell communications. We've looked at things like gap junctions. Okay, these are, if you remember, gap junctions, particularly in the heart, with our intercalated discs and how it allows for ions and things to flow from one cell to another. We've also talked about neurotransmitters and how they allow for cellular communication when we're talking about our neurons communicating with target cells. But there's also things like hormones, and hormones are dealing with chemical messengers, and they dump these hormones into the bloodstream as a way of getting to different target tissues, whether it's tissues or other organs in the body. But we also have, which not so much in this chapter, but in future chapters, we hear of things called paracrines. Para meaning next to, and this is referring to a local hormone that can be secreted into tissue fluids rather than the bloodstream to affect nearby cells. All of this being ways that cells are going to communicate with one another. But this chapter, we're focusing on hormones that are put into the bloodstreams. So as we can see here, we're going to have endocrine cells. So that's what we're seeing in this little picture here. And when we're looking at the endocrine system, it can be glands or tissues, or again, made up of cells that secrete the hormones. So what we're seeing here is the cells are dumping these hormones into the bloodstream, and it's going to course through the body, and then it's going to reach target tissue. And the important thing here is that the target cells have to have a receptor for the hormone. Think about when we talked about neurotransmitters. There were receptors on the surface of the cell for those neurotransmitters. Well, for hormones, there needs to be the same. There needs to be receptors for those hormones. And quite often, these hormones are going to travel a considerable distance away to reach those target tissues. Some examples is from your pituitary gland all the way down to the gonads. So some of the major organs of the endocrine system you need to know. We've talked about the pineal gland as releasing melatonin. We've talked about the hypothalamus being a major control center for the endocrine system, for a lot of what it does, and also the pituitary gland nearby, hanging from that structure called the infundibulum. Some of the other features that we see, we've got our thyroid, which sits right here, kind of wrapped around the trachea. On the posterior surface of the thyroid, we have what's called the parathyroid glands. You might remember those from the bone chapters when we talked about parathyroid hormone. And then we have the thymus. This plays an important role in our immune system. And then some of the other ones, we have the adrenal glands. Ad means on top, so sitting on top of the kidneys, or suprarenal is another word for it. We also have the pancreas, another one. Think about insulin. The pancreas secretes insulin. And then lastly, we have our gonads. So we have our ovaries in the females and the testes in the male. So those are the major major features we're going to be talking about in this chapter. Now the gonads, because you have entire chapters devoted to them, we don't spend as much time, really any time on the gonads. We spent very little about hormones that control them. That's it. A little introduction to it. So when we're comparing, we've heard way back in chapter, whatever it was, 5, I think, endocrine versus an exocrine. If you remember, an exocrine gland has a duct for external secretions. So when we're looking at these exocrine glands and their development, they form a duct that goes to the surface of the tissue. Okay, so your digestive system has a lot of these for various enzymes and various secretions. When we look at an example of our endocrine system, it does not have a duct. There is no duct. And instead, it has a network of blood vessels that it's going to dump its secretions into the bloodstream versus on top of the surface of the tissue, the apical surface. Okay, so when we're doing a comparison of the nervous system versus the endocrine system, some of the major things we talked about with nervous system, it uses an electrical stimulation, it uses neurotransmitters, and its reaction is very quickly. And it can have a very local effect, meaning it can go directly to a specific target cell. Endocrine, it releases hormones that go into the bloodstream. It's a chemical stimulation, and the reaction time can be slow. It can take days. And some of them can have a very general widespread effect. Now, I've mentioned this before. Your nervous system and your endocrine system can regulate one another. We can have these weird things where we have neurons secreting hormones, and we can see that the nervous system can affect the endocrine system, and the endocrine system can affect the nervous system. So they can stimulate and inhibit, and so forth, as we're going to see in quite a few examples. So again, this is kind of just looking at what we've talked about, how a neuron, how this is communication by nervous system and endocrine. So in the nervous system, we have an action potential that's sent down. We utilize neurotransmitters in order to stimulate or inhibit target cells. Endocrine, we dump hormones into the bloodstream. They course through the body, and then those hormones are going to bind to the target cells and have an effect on them. So utilize the bloodstream. So what we're focusing on today is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And we're first of all going to focus on the hypothalamus. If you remember some of the major things that the hypothalamus was in charge of back from when we talked about the brain, water balance was one of them, body temperature, your thermoregulation, sex drive, childbirth, and many of those functions are going to be carried out through the pituitary gland through releasing hormones. So when we look at the pituitary gland, there are two structures associated with it. They have independent origins and separate functions. The anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis. This one is more anterior, and it has two segments to it. We've got what's called the anterior lobe, and then the pars tuberalis, which is a little mass of cells that adheres to the infundibulum. And how it's linked to the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is going to regulate a lot of what the pituitary gland does, and it does so by something called a hypophyseal portal system. And what this means, a portal system, is when you have a cluster, and bear with me, I'm drawing this kind of crazily. A cluster, this is supposed to represent blood vessels. These are little blood capillaries, okay? Cluster of blood capillaries. And we have what's called a primary capillaries. And then what that leads down into is a portal system, which leads to another network of capillaries, little blood capillaries. So this is called a portal system. And a portal, think it's like shuttling something from one place to another. Well, what it's going to be shuttling is it's going to be shuttling hormones. So it's going to pick up, these little red dots represent hormones. It's going to pick up these hormones, transport them down this little portal, and then dump out the hormones where we have our secondary capillary bed. So capillaries are little tiny blood vessels where we exchange things and pick up things like hormones. And I'll show you this on the picture that I've got. So the primary capillaries and the hypothalamus connect to the secondary capillaries that are in our anterior pituitary. So this right here is in the hypothalamus. This travels down the infundibulum, and then this is in the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And that's what we're seeing right here. So what happens? These little neurons, and this is where things get a little bit weird because they're neurons, but they secrete hormones. These little neurons are going to secrete hormones, and they're going to dump them into these little red networks here. This is the primary capillaries right in here. It dumps those hormones and secretions into the blood vessels. They travel down this little portal through the infundibulum. Here's that little stalk where it adheres. Okay, pars tuberalis. And then it's going to release those hormones. That's what all these little dots are right here. It's going to dump them into the anterior pituitary. Now, what hormones are they? Well, all of these listed here in this purple box, these are going to be hormones that go down this portal system. They are gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, prolactin release inhibiting hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, and somatostatin inhibiting hormone. So these guys are all the ones that are going to be dumped through this little portal system. And we'll come back and talk about these in more particular. What they are going to do is they're going to control the release of other hormones from the anterior pituitary. And that's kind of where you see it turning red down here, or pinkish red, whatever. So this is a common theme with the endocrine system. We have hormones controlling the release of hormones, controlling the release of hormones from another part of the body. So it tends to be kind of a cascade. So from the anterior lobe, the hormones that are released from here are these in the pink. So these hypothalamic hormones are going to regulate the release of these anterior lobe hormones. And just to name them off, they are follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone. So I know this is complicated, but the more you look at it and study it, the less intimidating it is, and the words are not as scary. Okay, so let's talk about the anatomy of the posterior lobe. There are 3 parts to it. There's the median eminence, the infundibulum, and then the posterior lobe, or pars nervosa. And I will point those structures out when we look at the picture. This is very different from the anterior lobe in that it is more nervous tissue and not a true gland. And what happens is these nerve cell bodies that are in the hypothalamus pass down the infundibulum and down this what we call hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract and end in the posterior lobe. So tract right here tells you these are going to be axons passing down. So what they do is they will make the neurons, this is again where we get this weird crossover between the nervous system and endocrine. The neurons will make hormones in the hypothalamus, but then store them in the neurohypophysis to be released into the bloodstream. Okay, so if we take a look at these structures, this is the median eminence where it kind of comes down to a V right here. The infundibulum is this stalk that it hangs from. And then the pars nervosa, or posterior lobe, is this right here. So what we were saying, these are neurons, very different from anterior lobe. We're not dumping hormones into blood capillaries now. Instead, these neurons are going to produce the hormone here in the soma, transport that hormone down through the stalk, and store it down here in their little axon terminals. When it's time for them to release their hormone into the bloodstream, an action potential will shoot down and trigger the release of their hormone into the bloodstream. So it's weird. It's a neuron, but it's secreting these hormones. Now, the posterior lobe is much easier. There are only 2 hormones. Again, they are made up here in the hypothalamus and stored down here in the posterior lobe. And those 2 hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And we'll talk more about those in a little bit. So going back to our hypothalamic hormones, we're going to talk about altogether there are 8 hormones altogether produced in the hypothalamus. There are 6 of those hormones deal with the anterior lobe. The other 2 are going to deal with the posterior lobe. Again, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Those are the 2 that deal with the posterior lobe. The other 6 hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus are the ones that float through that little portal system and regulate the anterior lobe. So again, we already mentioned these. They were thyrotropin releasing hormone. Don't let the name scare you because thyro, just think it's going to deal with something with thyroid later. Corticotropin releasing hormone is going to deal with the adrenal cortex later at some point. Gonadotropin is going to deal with the gonads. Growth hormone releasing hormone deals with the release of growth hormone. And prolactin inhibiting hormone is going to inhibit the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary. And then somatostatin inhibiting hormone is going to have a couple of hormones that it will inhibit. I'm going to show you those in a little bit. So my little hint to everybody is if you see RH or IH behind the hormone, it comes from the hypothalamus and it is controlling and regulating the pituitary, the anterior pituitary. Like we said, the other two hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and they are stored and released in the posterior pituitary. And we'll talk about what they do in a little bit. Okay, so we're going to take a look at those 6 hormones that are created and released by the anterior lobe. Okay, so these are the ones that the releasing and inhibiting hormones are going to regulate. First of all, we're going to start off with our gonadotropin hormones. These are going to target the gonads, and they're stimulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is the one that comes from the hypothalamus and regulates their release. So the first one is called follicle stimulating hormone. And what happens with follicle stimulating hormone is it will stimulate the development of an ovarian follicle. What an ovarian follicle is it is the development of an egg. It's a cluster of cells that encourages the development of an egg so that that egg for females could eventually be released and possibly fertilized. For males, it's going to stimulate sperm production. So for both of these cases, follicle stimulating hormone is dealing with the production of those sex cells. Whether it's an egg, which is inside of what we call a follicle, or the sperm developing inside the testes. Okay, so then we have luteinizing hormone. And what luteinizing hormone does is luteinizing hormone will stimulate ovulation. Ovulation is the release of the egg, the rupture of it and the release of it from the ovaries, and it floats down the fallopian tube and possibly becomes fertilized by a sperm. Now, what it also will do is it will also stimulate this structure called the corpus luteum. Now, let me explain a little bit about what corpus luteum is because I know this is confusing. So if we have on the surface of the ovary, here's my ovary, we have a developing follicle, and inside that follicle is my little egg. Okay. Now, what happens with that egg is, again, it gets released from the ovaries, travels down the fallopian tubes, and possibly gets fertilized. Once that egg is released, what's left of the follicle doesn't just disappear and go away. It will eventually, but it turns into something called the corpus luteum. So it turns into this weird thing called the corpus luteum, and it's actually more of a yellow color. So that's orange. So if I color it more of a yellow color, and corpus luteum, it kind of refers to it being a yellow body. Okay, I think because it has some adipose tissue. So what happens with this corpus luteum, if I can get back to my color, is this is the remnants from this follicle, and it will secrete hormones. It's still active, and it'll secrete something called progesterone. And when we're talking about the follicles and this corpus luteum secreting things like estrogen and progesterone, what these hormones are doing is they're communicating with the uterus. So if I were to kind of draw the uterus a little bit, okay, if this is the uterus, these hormones are communicating with the uterus and preparing it for what's coming next. It's kind of like they're saying, whenever they secrete estrogen, they're saying, hey, uterus, I'm getting ready. It's communicating with it. we're developing an egg. There's the possibility it's coming your way. It may get fertilized. So the uterus can start getting prepared. One of the things it does to prepare is it installs receptors for a hormone that's going to be coming later, which is progesterone. So it's installing receptors for that. So once the egg is released, and then we've got this corpus luteum here, and it's secreting progesterone, it also is going to, this hormone signals to the uterus, kind of preparing it, saying, hey, uterus, we just ovulated and the egg's coming your way, so you need to be ready. Some of the other things that the uterine wall will do is it will thicken so that it can provide a nice cushiony environment for possibly a fertilized developing egg to implant. It'll also increase production of glycogen so that it has a glucose storage for the development. So these hormones are kind of communicating further down the line between the ovary and the uterus. So a little bit of that as to why we say those things. Corpus luteum secreting progesterone and so forth. You learn way more about that when you get into AMP2 and talk about reproductive. So for men, men also have luteinizing hormone. We also see luteinizing hormone, and this will stimulate the testes to secrete testosterone. And testosterone is going to encourage the development of sperm and also the secondary sex characteristics that we see in men. Okay, so that's a little bit about those two gonadotropin hormones. Again, they're released from the anterior pituitary. They're controlled by GnRH from the hypothalamus. So the next hormone is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And this one is stimulated by thyrotropic releasing hormone. This one comes from the hypothalamus. It can also be inhibited by somatostatin, inhibiting hormone. This is an inhibiting hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone has a hormone that can stimulate it and a hormone that can inhibit it. And what is this hormone going to do when it's released from the anterior pituitary? Well, it's going to stimulate the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. So like I said, we're constantly seeing a hormone controlling the release of a hormone, controlling the release of a hormone. So we've got hypothalamic hormone, which is TRH, stimulating the release of TSH from the pituitary, which is stimulating thyroid hormone for being released from the thyroid. It's like a domino effect in a sense. Okay, the other ones we're looking at, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This one is stimulated by corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and we call this one ACTH for short. This one is released from the anterior lobe. What it will do is it will stimulate the cortex, the outer layer of our adrenal glands, to secrete. There's multiple hormones that are released here, and we call them glucocorticoids, many of which are going to affect glucose levels in the body. We then have prolactin. Prolactin is stimulated by our thyrotropic releasing hormone. This one's kind of one of the weird ones, and by prolactin inhibiting hormone. So those two come from the hypothalamus and control the release of prolactin from the anterior lobe. What prolactin does, I want you to think in favor of milk production. This encourages the synthesis of milk, not the release of milk, the synthesis of milk from the mammary glands. For men, yes, there's also prolactin that's released, and it will enhance the secretions of testosterone by the testes. It enhances that effect. Okay, so almost lastly, growth hormone. Growth hormone is stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. It's inhibited by somatostatin. Okay, and its overall effect, it is going to stimulate mitosis and cellular differentiation, hence growth. Lots of mitosis and cellular differentiation. It has a widespread effect on that. So we can get cellular growth and repair. So all these hormones we just talked about Our hypothalamic hormones in the purple, so these guys right here, come down the portal system, and they're going to control the release of these hormones from the anterior lobe. Here we get to this nice little chart that I made. If you do not have this, it is available to you on Blackboard. So those hormones that signal from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary are right here. Here's the 6 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. What they do is they cause the inhibit of these hormones, which are released from your anterior pituitary. Okay. Once those hormones are released, these are the effects that they have down here. So thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid. Prolactin goes to the mammary glands. Adrenocorticotropic hormone goes to the adrenal cortex. Follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone go to the gonads. Growth hormone is widespread, going to the tissues of the body. Okay, so we have, again, hormones affecting the release of hormones, affecting the release of other hormones. Okay, so in this picture from your textbook kind of shows the same thing. We have thyrotropic releasing hormone causing the release of both prolactin and thyroid stimulating hormone going to the mammary glands and thyroid. We have gonadotropic releasing hormone causing the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone going to the testes or the ovaries. We have corticotropic releasing hormone causing the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone going to the adrenal cortex. And this is just showing the releasing hormones. We have growth hormone releasing hormone causing the release of growth hormone, which affects widespread fat, muscle, bone throughout the body and affecting our growth. The reason why we see the liver involved here is because there's an additional molecule that called IGF, which will prolong the life of growth hormone in the body. It makes it, I think, less, the body doesn't break it down as quickly. Okay, so now we're shifting back to the posterior lobe. What we're seeing here, again, we've got our nuclei. These are our nuclei that are associated with oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And what's going to happen with them? They make the hormone up here in the hypothalamus. They transport it down here to the posterior lobe, and then they dump oxytocin out into the bloodstream. Same thing with antidiuretic hormone. It gets dumped out into the bloodstream. What do hormones do? Well, antidiuretic hormone, if you think of a diuretic, which makes you go to the bathroom a lot, an antidiuretic hormone is going to reduce your urine volume. It prevents dehydration, and it causes your kidneys to hold on to water. We use this hormone if our blood volume is low. It helps us to maintain our blood volume by holding on to water. And if we're dehydrated, it helps us hold on to water so we don't become even more dehydrated. And how this is detected is the hypothalamic osmoreceptors, think osmolarity, think water, is going to detect dehydration in the hypothalamus and then release this hormone if we're dehydrated to help us hold on to water. So what does oxytocin do? Oxytocin is what we most commonly call is a love hormone. It's secreted during sexual arousal. So when we're talking about uterine contractions and propulsion of semen, all those things during sex, oxytocin plays a role. Emotional bonding between partners and infants as well. So that's why they call it the love hormone. It also stimulates labor contractions during childbirth. And it stimulates the flow of milk. So remember, prolactin is involved with the production of milk, but it's oxytocin that stimulates what we call milk letdown, and that's when a little baby is hungry and wants to be fed, and either hearing the cry of the baby or the baby suckling will stimulate the nerve endings, and oxytocin will be released from the pituitary, and that will cause milk to flow for breastfeeding. Okay, so we already looked at that. So when we're looking at our chart again, to focus on the posterior pituitary, here's my antidiuretic hormone, which is going to trigger the kidneys to retain water. And then our oxytocin, which causes uterine contractions and milk release. So some of the other little things we're going to talk about are the rates of secretion. They're not always constant. The body is going to adjust its secretions based upon what's going on outside. For example, and also we're going to get feedback from target organs. Your brain gets feedback from target organs. For example, in cold weather, when it's cold out, the pituitary is going to stimulate the hypothalamus. Is going to be stimulated by the hypothalamus, excuse me, to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And what's this going to stimulate? The thyroid. And the thyroid is going to release thyroid hormone, which is going to have an overall widespread effect on increasing the body's metabolism. This is why hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism can mess with people's metabolisms and heat generation. So again, that's in response to something going on, like it being cold outside. And again, we're going to see in here, rate the control of the pituitary secretions, a neuroendocrine reflex, where the nervous system can stimulate the endocrine system, as we're starting to see. I already mentioned this as kind of an example of this. If you have a suckling infant, it's nursing and it's stimulating nerve endings of the mammary tissue. And that's going to send signals to your hypothalamus, which is going to trigger the release of oxytocin, okay, from the posterior lobe. And then that's going to lead to milk ejection. So by stimulating those nerve endings, we get the release of the hormone and the release of the milk. Not only that, it can just be by a baby's cry, because when you hear a baby cry, and it does not even have to be your own baby, it can be someone else's baby, that can stimulate nerve endings inside your brain and trigger the release of oxytocin and trigger milk ejection. So, kind of an interesting thing. Hearing any baby cry can do it. So we also have ways of controlling it through negative feedback mechanisms. Good old negative feedback, where an increased target organ hormone level inhibits the release of that hormone. So it's kind of like you're filling up a tub of water, and once it's full, you can turn off the valve. So in our example here, we're looking at thyroid hormone. We have thyrotropic releasing hormone triggering the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which triggers the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. That's going to go to our target organs, to our target tissues. But the presence of that hormone in the bloodstream is also going to, because it's in the bloodstream and these guys have access to the blood, it's going to come up here and it's going to shut off the valve. Again, it's like the tub is full, we can turn off the water. That's negative feedback. We have the hormone, now we can shut it off. In other cases, we have positive feedback mechanisms, and this is an example that goes back to chapter 1. If we're talking about contractions in childbirth, stretching of the uterus will increase oxytocin release, which will cause contractions, and that will cause more stretching of the uterus, which will cause more contractions, and it keeps going in this positive feedback until the baby's delivered. So different ways of secretions. So when we look at a further look at growth hormone, a couple other things to talk about. Growth hormone has a widespread effect on cartilage, bone, muscle, and fat. And this is very important. I want you guys to remember this, because we're going to talk way more about this in the next recording too, is by looking at what it is these hormones do on a cellular level inside the cell, really macromolecules. What happens to the macromolecules inside of the cell? How growth hormone functions. If you think about it, for growth, we are going to need energy. Okay, so what happens? We're going to need proteins for building things. We're going to boost transcription and translation of DNA to make proteins. We're going to uptake amino acids. And we're going to suppress the breakdown of protein because we need proteins if we're growing. We are going to use fats for energy because they have a lot of energy stored in them. And we are going to save carbohydrates for the brain. This is called a glucose sparing effect. So will save our carbohydrates for the brain, and it'll make us use lipids for energy because they've got a lot of energy associated with them. And the brain always gets carbohydrates first. We do not compete with the brain. Also electrolytes. We're going to need lots of electrolytes for growing tissues as well. So we're going to promote the kidneys to hold on to them and not let go of them in our urine. Okay, so this kind of like when we're looking at cellular level, what are these hormones? What effects do they have on the cells? This is what it triggers them to do. Growth hormone, where we see it the highest when we're sleeping, makes sense. We're repairing things. When we're stressed or trauma, when we have hypoglycemia, which means low blood sugar, so that way we can use fat for energy and save the glucose for the bloodstream. Also during exercise, we see it. And during childhood and adolescence, we especially see high levels of growth hormone as well, which makes sense. And as we get older, we see a decline in the levels of growth hormone, which kind of lends a little bit to the understanding that we tend to see less protein and more fat accumulation as we age, unfortunately. Okay, so we're going to start in a couple of the endocrine glands and then call it a day on this recording. We're first going to talk about the pineal gland. Not much to mention here because we already have talked about this. The pineal gland is going to be releasing our melatonin. Okay, and so here's our melatonin. After age 7, it goes under involution. The gland shrinks a little bit. We know that the pineal gland has something to do with regulating our circadian rhythms, and it synthesizes melatonin from serotonin, and helps us with regulating our sleep and awake cycles. And if you've ever heard of seasonal affective disorder, this occurs we feel depressed, sleepiness, irritability, carbohydrate craving, and it's because the lower levels of light exposure in the winter months lends to an elevation in this melatonin production, which makes us feel sleepy. So a fix to that is getting some sunlight exposure to reduce those levels. We also know it may have something to do with the timing of puberty because we see in children where their pineal gland has been affected that it can mess with the onset of puberty. And the last one, the thymus. The thymus is kind of an interesting one because it is involved with your endocrine system, your lymphatic system, and your immune system. But the reason why we're talking about it now is because we're talking about the endocrine. And the reason why we're talking about it here is because the thymus will secrete lots of hormones for cellular communication dealing with your immune system. So it's hormones that are going to be involved with immunity in your immune system and communicating with those cells. It also is an important place where certain cells of your immune system called your T cells go to mature. Okay, so this is your thymus right here in an adult. In a newborn, look how big the thymus is. This is the thymus here. So it also undergoes involution after puberty. So again, the thymus develops T cells for your immune system, and it secretes hormones for the communication between those T cells and cells of your immune system.